things that questions can do. And in the hands of a skilled communicator, a well-crafted question can be more powerful than the actual answer. So today we're going to look at three things. We're going to look at the why question and why this question is important in certain contexts and why we shouldn't use it in others. Questions that shut people down. It's so often that I see this, and a lot of the time and I've done it myself multiple times, it's when we're acting on instinct. And a lot of the time that instinct is just a programmed response, what we think is going to work. And what I want to really invite everyone to do is just to bring consciousness back to the questions and just see which questions get which response. And if that was the only thing you did, then you would get very good with questions in a very short space of time. And then we've got questions that break or strengthen illusions. So if somebody's believing something that's not true, that's an illusion. Now, without knowing it, some of the questions that we ask will strengthen those illusions, and other questions that we ask will actually weaken them or break them. And it's really important to know the difference between the two. And this can become very valuable. And when I started researching this, it really became apparent that some of the questions that I was asking was actually strengthening the illusions of the person I was talking to. So it took a bit more research and investigation to then understand the question is very, very powerful and it will do things. And if you know what your question is going to do at a much deeper level, then your communication is going to improve substantially. Now, I do like to have a bit of a joke meme in there. Tips to become a better conversationalist. Ask people questions that give them an opportunity to talk about themselves. What the hell is wrong with you? Now, the irony is that people will ask that question or questions similar to that to people and not realize that that question is not going to get a good response. Okay, when a question criticizes, you're pretty much going to get the same in return or more. Okay, so I'm just going to really lay a bit of the foundation, because in order to understand which questions work, I just want to open up a couple of slides about, and the common slides on the project. And one of them is the importance of different views and context. And obviously, before we started recording, we had a couple of questions which really highlighted the importance of context. The context is king. The context is so important. It's not something we're going to talk about too much today, but the context in which you find yourself, obviously a question is going to be very different in different contexts. So it's really important to understand that that plays a role. And I'm just going to show this common slide to really point that out. So this is Jane and Joe. Jane doesn't believe a lot of the narratives that are being pushed on the public at the moment, but Joe does. Jane actually does do a lot of research. Joe watches a lot of the state-sponsored news and is really under the impression that he's well informed. And it would be my opinion that when we watch the corporate media, we're much more misinformed than we are informed. But if there was a fact that was placed between these two people, without context, we think that the fact would actually be true in all areas, and that's not the case. They've shown that a fact that's put into 4 different magazines will have a completely different believability based on where that fact resides, in which magazine it resides. So the context about where that fact is actually plays more of a role than the fact itself. And if we look into Joe's soapbox and we just say that Joe's soapbox represents his unconscious mind, Joe believes the media reports the truth. He doesn't realize it's now just corporate companies. He thinks that the government serves the public and there's not special interests governing them. He believes that science is uncorruptible. And if we look in 2023, 10,000 papers retracted. I think that stat alone should say that there's a problem there. If something's repeated safe 1,000 times, then Joe will probably believe it's safe, but the repetition of the word has no logical connection to its actual safety. And he believes and he has trust in the institutions that there's checks and balances. And I think it's clear to all now that if a corporation or a body is receiving funding from a certain place, then they are going to have conflicts of interest. And that has never become more apparent than in the last 5 years. And he thinks there's a consensus among certain belief systems. What he doesn't realize is that anyone that doesn't agree with the party line is being censored. Now that's so important, because I found out a fact the other day around the tobacco industry that really surprised me. So in 1970, tobacco advertising on the TV in the US was banned, and it turns out that it was actually pushed by the tobacco industry. Now, that didn't make any sense to me until we looked under the bonnet, and it turned out that due to the fairness doctrine, tobacco companies, every time they advertised, taxpayers' dollars went to the anti-smoking campaigns, and they was allowed to advertise in equal measure. It turned out that the anti-smoking campaigns were 5 times more effective than the smoking adverts. So in order to basically take away the anti-smoking campaigns' ability to voice their concerns, tobacco companies pushed to have tobacco advertising banned on TV. The fairness doctrine didn't apply to the newspapers and print ads, and then that's where the cigarette advertised. And up until that point, cigarette smoking had taken a steady decline, and when that ban come in, it went up again. So this censorship is so key, because it turns out that the anti-message to a message is often far more important. So the counter-argument is far more powerful than the argument itself in many instances. So that's why censorship plays such a massive role, because if you don't get to see the other side, then the consensus really does take a very powerful view. And I lost count to the amount of times that people said, "You're telling me that every scientist in the world is, lying?" And I'd say, but they haven't released the data. So if only 5 of them have seen it. So there's an example of an illusion. And Jane, on the other hand, she knows that censorship is rife. She knows that there's conflicts of interest. And we have really much a problem of corruption globally that I don't think anyone could imagine. She knows that these big non-government organizations have got their fingers in lots of pies everywhere. She knows that media effectively is a corporation now. And there's so many stories that Shara Atkinson in her book Slanted has shown that it's not. If that was true, it'd be on the news. That is a faulty belief, okay? She distrusts government. She's probably read a history book, and she knows that science is pretty much as corruptible as any other industry. And that figure that I quoted earlier of, I think, the 10,000 papers is very concerning. The good news is I think a lot of this is coming to the people's awareness now, and these are things that we have to solve. But if you look at these 2 different belief systems, you can now see that any fact is going to be seen through a very different filter. And that's what's really important. But one of the real key points to point out, and I won't go into it in detail today, that many of these beliefs that are in Joe's soapbox are not based on experience or reason. A lot of it is conditioned in there via certain methods of conditioning. So, for instance, the repetition with emotion to say it's safe is a very powerful way that the person will then just assume it's safe, but that's not connected to reasoning or logic in any way. And I think it was Oasis that said, if you tell everyone you're the best band in the world, people start to believe you. So this repetition, and particularly repetition with emotion, is why you see people believe in what they believe in. So in other talks, I've spoke about how these bits of information or belief systems get into people's minds, but we're not going to talk about that today. We're going to talk about the ability to question it, and why certain questions will weaken those beliefs and other questions will actually strengthen them. So this next slide is another common one. We talk about the engine room, and what it is that each of these belief systems in here, a lot of the time have been put in there via emotional conditioning, via the media and certain TV programs and movies. And trust really is trust in the institutions. But when you ask people to explain these, what you're going to find a lot of the time is there's actually no reason. So in logic, you would form a conclusion from a line of reasoning, and you would have, a certain logical bridge to get across the certain logic that you want to understand. But a lot of people's belief systems now have not been acquired by looking at logical reasoning or experiences. It's literally been conditioned in there. So you'll talk, people will say, oh, these anti-vaxxers, and they'll have a caricature of what they consider that person to be. But that isn't a match in reality. That literally has just been conditioned in there by repetition and emotional messaging. Now, that's why when you start to question these things, you can actually find that the person will not know what they're talking about, and they will. But what's really fascinating, and I'm sure you've all occurred it, is that people have been conditioned to believe false information. They've then been conditioned that false information is true. They've then been conditioned to have a level of certainty that shouldn't be present. So if there's been 3 months of testing over previously 10 years of testing, the level of certainty that people had about that new product was startling. So that certainty, again, is emotional. And then they've been conditioned to think that anyone that doesn't believe what they believe is an idiot, flat earther, all these terms you've heard them, Trump supporter, whatever. And they've then been conditioned another layer that it's okay to abuse you because you don't believe what they believe. So you think about the level of conditioning that has to happen for the person that comes to that. But the interesting thing is the whole thing is built on a house of cards. And with the right questions, that house of cards will start to tumble. Now, you've got to be quite careful and make sure that when you do start to crumble it, that the person doesn't end up in total despair. But in those situations, what's really important to the person is to have a support network. So if you're a friend and you start to understand them and they really start to see a lot of the information that they believe isn't true, then being very supportive is a really good thing. And I know it might be tough if they've been quite abusive, but that's going to help them on their journey. Okay, so the why question. The interesting thing about the why question is when you're talking to someone that believes something different about yourself, you actually shouldn't ask that question. So what happens is that when you ask that, why do you believe it's safe, for instance, what you're going to get is not a line of reasoning because that doesn't exist. What you're going to get is rationalization, blah, blah, blah. And in fact, what you're going to do is you're going to give them reasons to believe why they believe is true. So in fact, the why question has the opposite effect to what you want it to have. Okay. So what it is their belief is floating in the air with no support. By asking them why, what happens is they start to give it legs. Now, the people that are pushing certain narratives have provided a buffet of excuses, and all they're going to do is grab those excuses and put them under their belief, forming support. So I would say that in this instance, why is not a good question to ask. And there's many reasons why, but one of them is that when the brain is faced with explanatory demands, okay, what it does is it attempts to retrieve existing fragments of knowledge. But as we know, they don't exist because they haven't been educated with knowledge, or certainly not true knowledge in a lot of the instances. It's via conditioning, fear, emotional, etc. So what happens is the person will fill gaps with plausible sounding assumptions. Now, a number of the studies I went through this are literally mind-blowing. So they had situations where, first of all, they studied split brain patients. So they knew, so to quickly summarize, they would put something in the left visual field of a split brain patient. The brain would then be able to understand it, but because the language center isn't there, they wouldn't be able to say it. So then they'd say, so they would write on the left visual field, stand up. That person would then stand up and they'd say to them, why have you stood up? And then the person goes, oh, I just want to go and get a soda. So what the brain's going to do is it's going to look for the most plausible sounding assumption or the reason. And that's why when you ask people, why have you done this? You get these really weird, but they're socially acceptable in most instances. So you're going to get, why did you do this? Oh, to protect you, et cetera, et cetera. So you're going to get those rationalizations. That's why the why question is not a good one. And what you're going to get then is they're going to create causal narratives that feel logically consistent. Now, when you push against them, they're a house of cards. But what you're doing is you're getting that person to strengthen their illusion, okay? And that's not what you want to do. So there's some reasons why you don't want to ask the why question, because the brain, a lot of the time, it's going to look for, ways to make itself feel better. So if I say to myself, oh, why did I fall off the wagon today and eat 3 bars of chocolate? I'm not going to say because I've got no self-control. I'm going to go, oh, well, I've had a tough week and blah, 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 and whatever. You hear this in people all the time, okay? The ability to rationalize is really limitless. And the ability of an educated person to rationalize is incredible. Okay, so when you start to ask these questions, you're going to see mental gymnastics that you can't possibly imagine. Okay, so that's why you really don't want to go down that road. Okay, so one of the main drivers is really self-image protection. Admitting someone's ignorance really threatens our sense of competence, and the rationalization preserves the illusion. I had a conversation with an acquaintance recently that blew my mind. Their ability to rationalize absolute nonsense. I didn't think it was possible to go to the lengths that this person went to. I think I could write a whole book on their responses, but the ability to project one's own nonsense onto the other person. So I saw this quite common during the 2020, where someone would accuse you of doing the very thing that they're doing. And that's a problem. When you start to ask these why questions, you get into a very judgmental dynamic of communication, which doesn't help any of us. There's a very interesting study there, and obviously on the recording, you can look that up. And this is well studied, how people respond to this. So hopefully now you can see that why question is very problematic. And what you really want to do is, instead of the why, you want to ask someone to explain something. So you don't say, why do you think it's safe? You explain to me, can you explain how safe it is? Okay. And that changing question will actually show them the illusion that they hold. Okay. So just a subtle shift in those words. So I've really trained myself, hopefully, not to really ask this why question. Because it really doesn't get you much good information most of the time. Sometimes it's a brilliant question in personal development, but the problem is the brain's always striving to protect itself and look good in front of others. So you're going to get rationalization more than anything else. So hopefully that makes sense, and you can really see the benefits of knowing that. So the second one is questions that shut people down. Now, a lot of the time we'll ask a question and we won't realize the implications of that question. I mean, I've had people ask me questions in the past where I've just pointed out like what that question implies, and they realize how a lot of questions will trigger. So if you were to say, why didn't you look into it? Okay, you're not going to get a good response to that question, because it really sounds like blame and criticism. And what I've noticed is that most people, including myself, are very sensitive to criticism, and it tends to trigger people. And I've noticed that, particularly when I'm working with clients, a lot of the stuff I work in, we have a rule, which is like the customer's always right, which is the client is always right. You never make the client wrong, because it just triggers defensiveness, and that's the opposite of what you want. So really avoid, if you can, questions that infer blame or criticism. Now, that's probably, hopefully, should be another one of those obvious questions, but here's the key. We often respond or do things without thinking. And if we just bring a bit of consciousness to questions, you'll notice very quickly, because I noticed this, I realized a lot of the questions I was asking were not getting the information I wanted, and they were triggering people. And then when I started to think about what is the information I want, or where do I want to guide this person's attention, that's when you get very good with questions. So again, that's going to get a very muted response, or expletive response, should we say. Now, sarcasm is obviously something that we as people that have been challenging narratives have received a lot of. And what you'll notice that mockery is one of the real tendencies of the indoctrinated mind. Another thing is, have you joined a cult? Obviously, that's a projection question. What's really interesting is if we can resist being triggered, what you end up doing is having a real window of opportunity. So to this question, I would ask, well, may I ask what the tendencies of a cult are? What are the behaviors of a cult? What are the traits of a cult member? How do cults operate? Now, I've accumulated a lot of this information, so it's very interesting, because then I can relay it. And if you really want someone to pipe down very quickly, then you can point out that a lot of the things they're doing are actually tendencies of a cult. Now, there's certain information that suggests that that question is coming from projection, that at some part of their mind they realize that what they're doing is not free thinking, and then they will push that onto you. But as you see, if you ask them that or they ask you that, that question again is not very good. But if someone does ask you a triggering question, you do get an opportunity to basically connect. And one of the questions that I find really brilliant when they say you're a conspiracy theorist, if you can stay very calm and say, what did I say that was conspiratorial? What you're doing is that's going to break their illusion. They have a caricature that you're a conspiracy theorist and you're just piping all nonsense. But if you just get into the details, now that person that I mentioned that I was the most, irrational person I'd ever spoke to, who teaches business courses, funny enough, and it's obviously the most educated that tend to have those. I actually asked him, he called me a conspiracy theorist, and that's the first time it had happened in a couple of years. And I had to ask him 9 times, and he still refused to answer. So what that shows you is that he has no interest in the truth. He just doesn't like what you're saying. And obviously I hadn't found a way to get through his barriers, but that was just an example. There's going to be some people, and they generally are, you'll see them, there'll be the professors and the doctors, that they're so indoctrinated in a pathway. I do believe there's a way to get to everyone, but some are going to be a lot harder than others. And a lot of people are just going to follow the crowd anyway. So as long as, you start to get a lot of people understanding facts over fiction. So with good rapport, you can actually get someone in a friendly distance. I've had a number of times where someone's called me a name and I've just asked them politely to back it up, and then they've apologized because they've realized it was completely irrational and I hadn't said anything that should have triggered that. But this will show you that what it is that the conditioning is so powerful that when you start to push against any of those barriers, the person will get emotionally triggered. For instance, the conditioning is pretty much through the media. Every time they mention the word 5G, and anyone that questioned it, they would have said conspiracy theorists. So basically, much like any advertising of chocolate, etc., they're just going to say this, 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 this. And after a while, the person creates the link, and then they're just going to respond, but they don't realize that it's a conditioned response. They're not thinking, they're responding. And that's why when you understand this, the questions that you're asking the person is like you're pressing buttons. And once you realize that certain buttons are just going to get a programmed response, you'll stop pushing those buttons. So, there's a common one. I mean, the debunked thing is quite fascinating. So there's a number, and I want to avoid this video getting censored or taken down, I'm going to use some code words here. But there's a certain few science groups, and they go, X has no link to autism, and this is why. Okay, and then they're going to go, oh, it's been debunked, etc., etc. And then I'll go, well, of the 26 that are given to children, how many have been studied for the link? You see what you've done there is you've gone from an abstract to an actual very clear, and it turns out only one of them has been studied. Now, that has a lot of power when people start to realize that they've been told a generalization, but the truth isn't that. So this can open up a space of information transfer. So a lot of the time, when someone's engaging with you, it's always an opportunity. That's what I look at. And I always found that when we went on the marches, the person that had the most emotion and come up screaming at you were actually a lot easier to reach than the people that wouldn't talk to you. Okay, because they're very passionate about what they're talking about. And if you ask them a couple of fair questions, then a lot of the time they can really start to listen. So here's what is one of really good recommendations, is to basically ask a question or write down a question, write down a series of questions, and then literally almost stand in the other person's shoes and imagine how they would answer it. Okay, and then just observe the response and repeat. Okay, and obviously if you ask people questions, ask the question, notice the response, and you're going to get very good with questions in a very short space of time. So hopefully you can see now that a lot of questions will shut people down and a lot of questions will open people up. So it's important not to criticize. And here's the thing, to always caveat that with, people have been quite abusive to anyone challenging the narrative. So you have every right to respond in kind. The problem is that's exactly what the people pushing the narrative want. They want us fighting each other. Okay, so you've got a certain part of the population that is believing what they're being told by the media, and then the people that don't believe it, then we're fighting together. The ultimate is if we can show those people they've been lied to, they become like ex-smokers and they become very passionate about, telling everyone how they were misled. So now we're going to get on to this third bit, which is really key. Now, I wouldn't worry about understanding it all today because you can watch the replay, but it's really this concept of someone has an illusion about something. Now, certain questions are going to strengthen that illusion and certain questions are going to weaken or break that illusion. We've already discussed that the why question is going to strengthen that illusion, so that's not a question you want to ask. So here's some examples, and all I've taken is 3 from each, but there's quite an exhaustive list here, and I probably might do a workshop on this exactly, but an opinion question will strengthen someone's illusion. So if you say, do you believe X is safe? Why it strengthens, it encourages a simple yes or no without requiring any explanation or deeper thought. And a lot of the time, they're just going to give you what they've been told about that thing. So you're just going to strengthen their illusion. And a lot of us probably think that that question might weaken it, but in fact, it strengthens it. Second question, and this is sort of party. What I mean by party is like authority, institution, etc. So if you said, do you trust the government to approve of this product? They're going to go, oh yes, there's checks and balances. There's all these groups that do thorough checks. What they don't tell you about is that group is funded by the very people that they're trying to regulate. So it shifts focus from the product and to the trust and authority. So it bypasses detailed analysis. So it's really not a good question. And a third one, do you think that fluoride in toothpaste prevents cavities? So of course, what you're going to get then is the programmed advert. So it relies on familiarity and widely accepted claims, but they're claims. And most of the time, they're claims that are coming from the person that's pushing the product. So each of those questions will strengthen the person's illusion. So if you do ask those questions, the person's going to be even more confident in what they had, thought before. Now, here's some questions that start to break those illusions. So you can ask, what's the difference between fluoride's effect on dental health and its potential risks? Can you explain both sides? So what they have to do now is they have to go into the details. And what they realize is that they won't have any of the details. It will be a sound bite or a piece of, advertising, etc. And of course, that opens it up that if you've done your I'm always reluctant to use the word research now because even that's got a bad name. But if you've done your homework, looked into the data, compiled it, and looked at both sides thoroughly, then you should understand clearly why something is true or not true. Evidence-based probing, this has been really powerful. So I'd say, how many of the X has been tested for its link to autism? And what you get is like just a stunned silence. You'll get a lot of, people like it, etc. But what I also do when I post these things, a lot of the time I'll say, oh, and a laughing emoji or abusing me is not a scientific response. And what you do if you're going to post it on social media, that inoculates against those answers coming back. So this demands familiarity with specific evidence. Now, what you're going to see is a lot of people that are claimed to follow science and they're going to be science bods, but they're not. They're going to be, like Apple junkies. They're just going to want the prestige that comes with I follow science. So, during the time when there was a release in the product, I'd say to someone wrongly, I'd say, well, why are you getting it? Because I believe in science. Okay, or I follow the science. And of course, all I've done is strengthen their illusion. But if I said, oh, can you explain that to me? What's its efficacy, etc., then they're going to realize that they don't believe in science or follow science. They just want to say that because they want the prestige that comes with it. Process-oriented questions are very powerful. So, when someone says it's safe, well, what's the safety testing? Are you familiar with the processes? Okay, so it requires detailed knowledge of the safety protocols. Now, obviously, you want to know these if you're going to ask those questions, but also you've got to be careful to understand the context in which these questions occur. So, you know, if you're talking to someone and they're claiming to know a lot about it, then, and also it's really important as well not to make someone feel silly. So, you know, I would frame it as, you know, if we had been misled, etc., it's understandable to think it's safe, etc. So you really want to give, one of the biggest tips I could say about communication is always give the person's ego a way out. Give them a way of saving face. Okay, a lot of people would rather die than lose face. I mean, it's quite incredible how that happens. I mean, there was a thing in the 1900s in the UK, it might have been a bit earlier, where if someone disrespected you, you challenged them to a duel at dawn with pistols. Think about that. People would actually rather die than being shown disrespect. Incredible. So yeah, so give people a chance to save face. So if we, in summary, hopefully now we understand the why question and why it's not a good question in many contexts. You're more familiar with the effect of a question that will shut someone down. If it criticizes them or makes them look silly, etc., then you're not going to get a very good response. And this thing of questions that break or strengthen illusions. Now, I'll probably put a whole piece out on this in the future of all the different categories, but we showed you 3 of each, which obviously you can review. But hopefully you'll see that a question, what it often doing is it guides attention, or it takes someone on a journey with a destination. Now, what you can do, which we're working on, is you can start putting questions together, and you can actually walk someone out of a hypnotic trance question by question, which is very powerful. We'll start to look at that going forward. But hopefully you can understand and see the value of this and appreciate that whilst you know so much now and about what's going on in the world, you probably don't have an information problem. But if you can learn to really communicate that information and elicit in other people with the power, then you're going to have so much more success. So just in summary, hopefully that made sense. So if you do wish to support the project, we're working on a number of interesting projects at the moment. So you can obviously donate if you wish to, or you can just attend a workshop, which would help us out. And I'm thinking of putting one on questions. I think that could be very useful. I'm going to open up for Q&A.